Today, we're going to take a look at the state of Soviet artillery, mortars, and anti-tank guns on the Axis Soviet front on the eve of the Great Patriotic War. Soviet artillery was split into two forces, the first being the regular force artillery, the organic regiments and battalions that are within rifle divisions and corps are part of this force artillery. Then we have artillery from the Reserve of the High Command, shortened to RGK, later RVGK. This reserve force was a centralised pool of units that could be attached to Soviet armies and corps during the war. At the outbreak of war in 1941, 92% of all Soviet artillery was in the regular force artillery. 92% were in the 94 Corps artillery regiments, which were supporting armies, corps, and divisions at the front. This meant that barely 8% were in the RGK, the Centralised Reserve Artillery Force. And when we look at the total amount of Soviet artillery on the 22nd of June 1941, we find that they had 117,600 guns and mortars, but 37,500 guns and mortars were located in the western border military districts, with the rest nowhere near the front. This is going to be bad, as you'll see. In June of 1941, a typical rifle division would have a light artillery regiment of 2 battalions, with 8 76mm field artillery guns and 4 122mm howitzers each, totaling 24 artillery pieces. They also had a howitzer regiment of 2 light battalions with 12 122mm howitzers each, plus a medium battalion with 12 152mm howitzers, bringing the total to 36 howitzers. And there was an anti-tank battalion with 18 45mm guns, plus an anti-aircraft battalion with 12 37mm anti-aircraft guns. This means a division had 294 guns and mortars at 50mm sizes or greater. But is this really the case? Well, no, because this was actually the paper strength. The reality was significantly different. Here is a chart of the fulfillment of artillery and mortar pieces for the units in the western military districts on the 22nd of June 1941. If the blue bar is at 100%, then the units have enough weapons. Clearly, they didn't have enough weapons. In terms of 45mm anti-tank guns, units on the Axis Soviet front only had 62.3% of their weapons. They were, therefore, about to be attacked by panzer divisions and didn't have nearly 40% of their weapons that they needed to fight against them. In terms of artillery, Soviet divisions had 66% of their 76mm artillery guns, just 42.8% of their 122mm howitzers, and around about 40% of their 152mm guns. These were the guns found in rifle divisions, meaning that rifle divisions were missing at least half of their artillery. Considering that the Germans alone outnumbered the Soviets on the first day of the war, and considering that most of the German divisions are infantry divisions, and that there were infantry in the panzer divisions as well, the Soviets were severely lacking in the tools required to fight back against them. Then we come to the light 37mm anti-aircraft gun, almost at 100%, so not really an issue there, unlike the 76mm anti-aircraft gun, which may as well not have bothered. We will come back to discussing the Soviet anti-aircraft arm a little later in the video, which is very interesting in itself, but for now, let's look at the mortars. At first glance, you might think that the 120mm mortar being at 93.4% is good because this will make up for the loss of the other two. However, this is a chart showing the percentage of requirement, and the Soviets weren't allocating many 120mm mortars to their units. Instead, they were relying on the 50mm mortars. So, hypothetically, let's say the Soviets required 100 of the 120mm mortars and were given 93, they'd be at 93%. But they may need 10,000 50mm mortars and were given 7,600, and thus this would be 76%. So, what they would need in this hypothetical scenario is 7 of the 120mm mortars, and then 2,400 50mm mortars. So actually being down in the 50mm and 82mm mortar percentages is significantly worse than this chart makes it out to be. Same goes with the 76mm artillery gun, which were used a lot more often at the time than the other types. And if you think this material requirement and fulfillment is bad, it gets worse. Artillery doesn't have an infinite range and needs to move, but in the Red Army there was a massive shortage of trucks and tractors to tow the guns and carry ammunition. Only 37.8% of Soviet combat formations had their required tractors when the war began. The RGK lacked up to 85% of their required tractor systems for movement. And on the 22nd of June 1941, most of the vehicles that they did have required repair. And the problems continued to mount. Half of the RGK artillery had no repair, reconstruction, or other logistical support. And all artillery units were supposed to have artillery correction aircraft to help them aim the artillery. But few of the units actually had them. The Soviets themselves noted that junior and mid-range artillery commanders were poorly trained and unable to lead their artillery effectively in combat. Target acquisition was poor, and commanders were unable to coordinate fire with cooperating units. There was also a shortage of artillery ammunition, especially for anti-aircraft guns and anti-tank shells. But, according to a report prepared by Lieutenant General Parsarov, Southwestern Front's Chief of Artillery, which was written on the 14th of July 1942, the worst problem was that of transport for artillery resupply. The report states that the majority of units had to leave more than half of their ammunition at their base when the war began, most of which was subsequently blown up or fell to the enemy. As we said earlier, the Soviets had 117,600 guns and mortars, and only 37,500 of these were at the front. Because of the lack of transport, Soviet artillery could only be deployed piecemeal. So just looking at the sheer numbers does not tell the full story. There was also the issue of anti-tank units. The Soviets had neglected anti-tank warfare until they saw the fall of France in 1940. They suddenly realised that anti-tank warfare was essential, which was far too late. As a result, an anti-tank artillery brigade was created in each army. An anti-tank brigade in June of 1941 had 5,309 men, with 120 guns, mostly of the 76mm category. But the Soviets didn't have the weapons to create these new units. So, on the eve of war, most of the divisional and corps artillery units were taken away to form the new anti-tank brigades. This meant that divisions didn't have enough anti-tank guns and had to rely on anti-tank rifles, which weren't going to be effective. This is why the Red Army soldiers ended up using many of their anti-aircraft guns as anti-tank guns rather than as anti-aircraft guns. And since there were already shortages of basically everything, the anti-tank brigades themselves were also lacking in trucks, tractors, and had trouble conducting reconnaissance and acquiring targets. On top of all of this, the NKO, which is short for Ministry of Defence or People's Commissariat for Defence, decided to abolish the post of Chief of Red Army Artillery, and the result, to quote Glantz, left the Red Army's artillery decentralised, poorly controlled, relatively immobile, without adequate logistical support, and largely ineffective when war began. The Germans then exploited these flaws. When Operation Barbarossa opened up, Soviet artillery forces had been outmaneuvered and destroyed. 4 of the 10 anti-tank brigades were completely wiped out in the initial battles, and many of the others reduced in the fighting as well. And because the Red Army was forced to deploy their anti-aircraft guns as anti-tank guns to stop the waves of panzers, this crippled the air defences at a time when their own air force had been crushed. The Germans then proceeded to annihilate the Red Army's anti-aircraft forces and air force as well, leaving the Soviets without any air defences and completely vulnerable to Stuka attacks. Some have claimed that the Soviet Union was going to attack Germany in the July of 1941, which is why the Germans had to invade in the June of 1941. Given the state of Soviet forces at the eve of war, we can confidently conclude that this wasn't the case. They were outnumbered, didn't have anywhere near enough equipment, had massive logistical and supply issues, didn't have enough trucks, their tanks were out of date, their air force was basically useless, and they were forced to use their anti-aircraft guns as anti-tank guns and thus had no air defence. To attack would have been suicidal. In fact, to defend was suicidal, and it's no wonder many chose to surrender. And this is why, when people claim that the Red Army soldier was cowardly or inferior to the amazing German Aryan, they've missed the other side of the equation. If you're getting attacked by tanks, artillery, infantry, dive bombers and so on, and all you have is some outnumbered friends, a couple of rifles and an anti-tank gun, total defeat is your only option. And if you had the equipment and weren't overwhelmed by sheer weight of numbers, you'd fight back. And this is the point to take away. Looking at the sheer numbers alone does not tell the full story. There was a massive shortage of weapons for the Soviets, but even with the weapons they did have, because of the lack of trucks and tractors, the Soviets deployed their forces in penny packets. So if you imagine 100 Germans going up against 500 Soviets, yeah, they're outnumbered, but not if the Soviets send in 50 men at a time. Obviously, this is an extreme example, but you get the point. The same applies with Soviet artillery and tanks. They're actually outnumbered at the tactical level, and even in those scenarios where they're not outnumbered, they're missing the other arms, which means, as I've said before, they're playing rock, paper, scissors, but only allowed to pick rock. I will come back and look at the evolution of Soviet artillery over the course of the war, but I wanted to set up the scene today. Many people still think that the Soviets were gearing up for war, even when I showed that not to be the case in my Keitel and Viktor Suvorov video. Many still claim to this day that just exposing how Viktor Suvorov was willing to manipulate the evidence to support his conclusions didn't make his views invalid. Well, this video has shown that the Soviets weren't in a position to defend, let alone attack. If you're of the opinion that the Soviets were planning to attack the Germans and that the Germans had to do something about it, well, you might be interested in my Suvorov video. Thank you to my patrons for your continuing support. You make these videos possible because you're awesome. And to everyone, thanks for watching. Bye for now.